Hello, I'm Rachel Coombes, a History of Art DPhil student at St John's College in Oxford. The great writer Leo Tolstoy once claimed that music is the shorthand of emotion. Tolstoy recognised music's capacity both to convey emotion and to have influence over listeners' emotions. We choose music that befits the mood of a particular occasion, and we listen to certain kinds of music as a way of inducing specific feelings. The use of music in films relies on this. Think of the screeching violin in the infamous shower scene of Hitchcock's Psycho, or of some of the poignant, haunting moments in Howard Shore's score to The Lord of the Rings. Of course, music's emotional capacities were appreciated long before the advent of film, and long before Tolstoy was writing in the late 19th century. In fact, the relationship between music and emotion began to be truly systematized during the 17th century. And this was around the time that the embroidery, a musical party, which hangs in the Music and Tapestry Gallery on the second floor of the Ashmolean, was believed to have been made. This vast embroidery, which measures 4.7 metres in length and 2.5 metres in height, gives us a glimpse into the lives of a noble family engaged in the leisurely pursuit of music-making. It's a statement piece. Even in a large room, its rich textural qualities and detailed imagery really hold our attention. With this in mind, I want to think not only about the music-making depicted in the work itself, but also about the role of music in the emotional lives of the people who might have originally owned and appreciated the tapestry. The setting for this musical party is an imagined exotic ornamental garden, filled with lemons, oranges, pears and grapevines. Clearly this abundance of fruit signifies warmer Mediterranean climes, invoking a vision of sumptuousness and opulence. Elaborate architectural and ornamental details surround the figures. Note the bulbous vases resting on the balustrade, overflowing with flowers, and the way in which this balustrade actually extends all the way backwards, enclosing this curious pergola in the centre. And then, of course, we have our musical protagonists in the centre. On the right is a man playing the viola da gamba, a precursor to the cello, and on the left, a woman playing the lute. Perhaps they are husband and wife, or lovers. They are accompanied by a young boy, who might be their son, and a servant, plus a small but select audience of animals, including a little dog, a monkey caught in the act of eating a pear, a peacock, a turkey, and a deer. The hanging of the work, with its rather ostentatious imagery, could be seen as an emotionally charged act in itself. Like music, tapestries and wall hangings, such as this embroidery, can help in the orchestrating of particular environments by providing a literal backdrop to certain occasions. Aren't tapestries, after all, an important manifestation of our centuries-old desire to transform interior walls from mute surfaces into decorative panoramas, commemorative scenes, or even acts of worship? They are not simply static objects. They could be rolled up and moved around residences far more easily than framed paintings. But like framed paintings, these movable fabric murals are wonderful storytellers. Think of the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest. It is more minute and detailed in some particulars than the written history itself. Now it seems likely that the story being told here in a musical party is a somewhat idealised reflection of the life and pastimes of its owners. Who might they have been? In truth, we will probably never know. But what we do know is that in the 17th century, tapestries and wall hangings were among the most cherished possessions of the European nobility, and one of the most important status symbols of power and wealth. Indeed, a textile hanging could cost as much as a battleship. It really was one of the most expensive art forms in existence. The silk and metal threads that we find in a musical party were probably imported from overseas, and are a kind of material indication of luxury. Now, it's important to note that this work is not in fact a tapestry at all, but a needlework embroidery. That is to say, it is stitched by hand rather than woven on a loom. Imagine the time it would have taken to produce such a work. The labour-intensive nature of the embroidery process would have made this hanging all the more expensive. Clearly, whoever owned this work was wealthy and wanted to show it. So let's pick up the musical thread again and return to our protagonists in the embroidery. Within high society circles, music played an extremely important role, helping in the presentation of a public image. Musical performances were central to social occasions held within the sorts of aristocratic domestic spaces for which we can assume this embroidery was intended. The very subject of the work reflects one of the most popular pursuits of a cultured nobility who would have had the financial means to commission hangings and tapestries. But what might these two embroidered musicians have been playing? As I've said, at around the time this textile was made, the relationship between music and the emotions began to be rethought. Indeed, composers in the 17th and 18th centuries developed an entire theory of affects, or emotions, creating catalogues of musical figures to express those emotions. Musical rhythms, sequences and scales were categorized into emotional states such as joy, anger, sadness, love. The idea was that listeners could not only recognize the emotions expressed in such music, but also experience those emotions themselves. Now, a popular compositional form in the 17th century, inextricably linked to emotional expression, was the dance suite, a collection of short contrasting works. Each dance form correlated with a specific emotion. Minuets and joviality, gavottes with joy, the saraband with sadness, for example. Although this musical form originated in the late 14th century as music for dancing to, as we move into the 17th century, it increasingly became a format for simply listening to and appreciating. The pairing of the viola da gamba with the lute that we see here was in fact a fairly common setup for the dance suite at this time. But as one might imagine, emotional self-control and regulation was an important factor within social interaction among the nobility. It was not the done thing to allow oneself to be carried away by demonstrative emotions. But this is where music came in. Musical performances, as depicted here, afforded a sort of emotional release from this regulated social setting. In listening to, say, the light lilting rhythms of a gavotte dance, the audience could enjoy a sort of communal emotional response, recognizing the distillation of feelings of joy into audible patterns. It seems likely that this embroidery might have hung in a domestic space used for musical performance. After all, hanging soft furnishings within a space for music making was a standard method of improving acoustical quality, as the fabric dampened unwanted reverberations. So now I want to imagine the physical encounter between the figures of the embroidery itself and the occupants of an elite, elegantly decorated domestic space. Maybe real musicians were vying with these embroidered musicians for attention in the interior space, setting up a kind of self-conscious theatricality. The bodies of these almost life-size musicians in the textile hover on the brink of this real space. Both performers are angled outwards towards us, and their placement at the foot of the scene draws them even closer into the presence of the embroidery's viewers. If we look really closely at the work, we can identify certain motifs which disrupt our sense of its being an illusory representation. The hat that lies awkwardly and rather unconvincingly on the ground by the gentleman looks as if it could be plucked from the surface. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that the hanging has been deliberately constructed in such a way as to cast its viewers as guests at this musical celebration. They, or we, are observer participants in a form of intimate emotion associated with the performance of music. These embroidered performing bodies that are both of and not of the real interior space may have prompted a self-awareness of conduct between the real bodies in the room. That is, a paying of close attention to one's own body and those of others. Thinking like this has implications for the depiction of the black servant here, if we consider the impact that this portrayal might have had on a servant of colour occupying the real space of the interior. Of course, the depiction of black servants within European paintings of this period was by no means unusual. After all, at this time the possession of a black servant in Europe was, among the social and political elite, an indication of wealth. This figure's role within the embroidery is not necessarily one of obvious subservience. Numerous paintings of the 17th century show black slaves in collars and uniform. The servant here, whose garments both efface the individual's gender and enhance his or her difference from the other figures, is instead part of a broader enactment of privilege. They are an accessory, just like the fruits that they bear, reflecting the fashionable taste and prosperity of the owners. The figure is grouped closely with the musicians, even leaning in towards them, in a way that suggests he or she is a part of their unit. Far more so, at least, than the shabbily dressed figure in the corner, who perhaps has the purpose of injecting a note of humour into the scene, as if he has just stumbled upon a party to which he is not invited. Today, we might feel discomfort at the issues arising from the black servant's precarious identity within the scene. And this emotion is exactly one that museums today are to some extent actively nurturing, by confronting the uncomfortable truths, often relating to the slave trade and Europe's colonial past, that visual culture can reveal. As we can see, even apparently straightforward works such as this textile bear traces of historical racial attitudes that it has been all too convenient to ignore. So next time you're able to go into the Ashmolean, perhaps pay a visit to this embroidery, and try to imagine the rich life that it might have had before it arrived on the walls of the museum. There is much to unearth in this curious needlework hanging about the bygone world of courtly ritual, and the central role that music played in allowing the expression and release of emotion in an otherwise highly regulated society.